Welcome to Hence the Future podcast. I'm Justin Clark,
I'm Mattimore Cronin.
and today we're discussing the future of 3D printing. So that means we'll be exploring what 3D printers may one day be capable of, how technology may be applied to certain industries, and what that will mean for consumers, businesses, and society as a whole going forward. But first, maybe, Mattimore, do you want to talk a little bit about what 3D printers are capable of today?
Yeah, totally. So there was a lot of hype around 3D printers 6 or 8 years ago, and people
Mhm.
were calling it the fourth industrial revolution. And everyone's going to have a 3D printer in their home, and they're going to be making knickknacks and fixing their fridge with little parts. And, there was so much hype around it.
hmm
And what happened? 6 to 8 years later, I only know a few people who own a 3D printer, and
Yeah.
most people don't. But it has made some pretty incredible progress in industry, in manufacturing, in
hmm
B2B.
Yeah.
So it has not yet fulfilled its vision for consumers, but it's done some pretty exciting things for industry.
Yeah. I
Like,
mean, it's hard to really be a consumer. Like, there's such a barrier to entry with 3D printing because you need to know something like CAD, like computer automated design, and these other things. And I think that's one of the reasons it just kind of stagnated. Because I sort of bought into that hype too. It was really cool to do some of that stuff, but I had engineering friends, and in college, all the engineering classes had 3D printers, so it was just the coolest thing ever. And then, when you realize, okay, what's the practical use case of this back then, especially when you're just making plastic stuff,
right.
it's
You make a
it,
little model of the David or like the
yeah,
Eiffel Tower, and it's
yeah,
cool, but it's like, yeah, but
okay,
3D printers are getting a little bit easier to use. Like some of them now are just as simple as you download an STL file and then you
right,
can just upload it, so you don't really
hmm
need to know CAD. Just the person who designed it needs to know CAD. Um,
right,
and another interesting change that's happened is that in 2009, the cost of 3D printing went down by like 100x because a
mm,
patent expired from the father of 3D printing. This guy, do you remember? Do you know his name? It's like Crump. Oh yeah, S. Scott Crump was his name. But
mm,
he's the guy that first developed the fuse deposition modeling method. And this is basically how like 99% of 3D printers work today, which is essentially you're just layering this thermoplastic or whatever the
mm,
material is on top of each other enough times so that it builds a 3D structure.
yeah,
Some people have critiqued this and said that it's not even really 3D because you're just like layering a bunch of 2D layers on top of each
right.
other. But I've heard other people say, well, that's kind of, you could say that about anything. Like anything is just, if you make it small enough, like it could be considered two dimensional or, um,
Right.
so,
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about that's called additive manufacturing, right? Just
right,
this,
yeah.
just adding one layer. There's a lot of issues with that too, because, and we can talk about some of these new technologies that are being developed right now with like Carbon is one of the big
Mm-hmm.
3D printing companies, but what they this additive manufacturing where you would print layer by layer, you're still constrained with what you can create. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, you couldn't create an inner sphere and an outer sphere and have that inner sphere totally loose. And like once this 3D printing structure is done, you couldn't just like shake this ball and have another ball within this thing.
Right.
So
Yeah. It also
you
gets really
always,
complicated when you have multiple materials.
yeah. And that's maybe one thing too that has gotten a little bit better. I mean, it's still not wonderful, but a lot of these are still plastic-based materials.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of times, if you need a little bit more structural integrity, which is another issue I can talk about with the additive manufacturing, but sometimes they'll add little metal filaments or carbon fiber filaments to plastics and maybe increase the strength of these materials a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot more materials being created right now.
Yeah,
I
you can
think,
use titanium.
yeah,
And there's like,
metal stuff is really awkward. Like it doesn't
Right.
really look that great when you see a metal material 3D printer. Um,
Yeah, I have some
s-
stats here, and the most common metal 3D printing materials are
uh-huh.
aluminum, which is
Yeah.
57% of all. Stainless steel is the next at 35%, and then titanium at 6.5 and cobalt at
Mm,
1.5. And
yeah.
yeah, it doesn't look great, but obviously it's a lot stronger than using thermoplastics. And I mean,
Right.
it can be really important, especially when we talk about like medical applications, like printing prosthetics. And
Right.
like one of my good friends from high school, he got his jaw broken, and he had to have total
Mhm.
reconstructive surgery of his jaw. And right before he was supposed to
Wow.
have this surgery, the doctors and surgeons 3D printed a model of what his jaw would look like and how it would fit together after the surgery that they had planned. And they realized when they
Hmm.
got the model that it would be completely misaligned, and he would basically like look like a crazy person with like a jaw jutting out and like to the left, and like his upper jaw jutting to the right, even though like medically it was
No.
still sound. Like it would just look ridiculous. And so at the
Right.
last second, they postponed his surgery, and then they did it the right way after like testing it out on the 3D model.
Mm.
And now his jaw looks great. And you would never know he had surgery, and he's got like, that material. Uh,
Yeah. That's one of the things that this new company, well, I don't know exactly when it was founded. It's probably been in the works for a while, but they've been raising a lot of money recently, carbon 3D printing or
hmm
something. But they are working a lot in the biomedical space, and one of their big examples is creating dentures.
Yeah.
Because like when you get an X-ray or a CT scan, you can actually recreate what what would be a really difficult thing to create, like the teeth structures.
Yeah.
Um, Typically, I believe it was this sort of artisanal process where people would hand create some of these teeth if you wanted them to look really good. Whereas now this company can just 3D print entire dentures.
Yeah.
And maybe we should talk a little bit about Carbon 3D's actual technology because it isn't the additive manufacturing.
Oh, cool.
It's
Yeah.
something new entirely. This is the one. This is a company that's working on light-based 3D printing. So basically, they have
Oh, I think I've heard
this
about
resin.
this.
Yeah, they have this resin, and essentially, the light, they can focus this light in specific areas of the resin, and then it hardens in that specific area.
Hmm.
And this is one where we actually can create a complicated structure like an inner sphere and an outer sphere without actually having them touching. And then they also partnered with Adidas and they created the soles of shoes last year. I
Right.
think it was like 100,000 shoes, and they're creating this sort of mesh that is actually structurally sound, and they can use materials like silicone and other things that are maybe a little bit more durable plastics, but also they give a little bit, so that they can
Right.
create these really cool structural materials. And I also think one of the brands they teamed up with was Russell, the I think mostly football equipment,
Yeah.
like
Uh-huh.
American football equipment company, and they were creating helmets. And
Uh,
they created this mesh structure within the helmet itself to hopefully alleviate the concussion problem more because this mesh structure could absorb shock better than previous like foam based methods.
right. Yeah, I mean, we kind of talked about how machine learning design can be
Hmm.
way more structurally sound and way
Hmm.
lighter and more flexible than what a
Yeah.
human would do, which is typically like, oh yeah, make it flat, make the corners like even, and just like a
Yeah.
very like cookie cutter way that humans
Hmm.
tend to design things. We talked about that in the future of aviation. And it's
Right.
interesting how that sort of like machine learning design combined with 3D printing, especially this newer type of 3D printing that you're talking about with
Hmm.
carbon, can both together create structures that no human would be able to design and no human would be able to implement on
Mhm.
their own, which is pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, and if you think of the old manufacturing methods, typically what 3D printing is compared to is injection molding. So you
Hmm.
have to, so if you want to make a plastic part, you need to create some sort of metal mold where you just put a lot of hot plastic in there and eventually it dries out and you have a plastic part. But that's so, like you were saying, it's so limited in what you can actually create with something like that. So if you
Right.
wanted to create intricate tubing, for example, which is something that might be necessary, if we're thinking longer term for people on the International Space Station, like they don't have
Oh yeah, I
access
have a
to new
lot to
things.
talk about with that.
Yeah, and maybe we should because
Yeah.
this is one of those things that 3D printing can really revolutionize. It can help us with these colonies on Mars or with people up in the space station that don't really have access to any new parts. They're going to have to create new parts. So instead of sending up every single
Right.
product or every single part that they're going to need, instead you're just going to have to make it there wherever you are.
Right. And they say that's why it's such a good application for quote businesses in isolation. So right
Mm,
now, a lot of times that's, if you're on an oil rig, you can't
yeah.
always get the right materials, or if you're in a submarine, or like you said, in outer space, that's probably the biggest one
Mm,
where you're just totally isolated and you can't get the materials. And
mm,
when I was thinking about that, it's like, okay, if you want to be able to replace any piece of equipment on a ship, a spaceship,
mm,
then one way with current 3D printing technology is every piece of the ship needs to be small enough to be recreated in the 3D printer. So it would be
mm,
like more of like a modular design. But ideally, if we're thinking far future, like once the Mars colony is
mm,
thriving, then it would make way more sense if the 3D printer was unbounded, meaning it could just sort of float around and sort of, fix and reprint parts of the ship, like without actually needing it to be like internally contained in the printer. And I mean, this
mm.
kind of gets into
Interesting.
some far future ideas like the von Neumann probe, where if you can get these like sort of nano assembly bots that can construct
Oh,
things
right.
on the atomic level, then you could
Mm,
essentially just like build anything. And we talked also in quantum computing about how, even if you have a true vacuum in space where there's nothing, like no electrons, no photons, absolutely nothing, even then electrons will just pop into existence. And,
mm,
we also talked about in the future of nuclear how you can basically harness the energy of the cosmos by like unleashing the power of what's in the nuclei. So you could imagine a scenario in the future where it's like you can sort of just build things on like the subatomic level to
mm.
basically build whatever the hell you need, and maybe it's powered through like through that sort of like nuclear power of the cosmos, or some other like quantum power that we don't even quite know about. but
Yeah.
but if you think about like what's the furthest potentiality of something like this, it's basically
Mm,
like you could assemble anything in the universe like on demand
mm.
just using these like little mini assembly bots.
Yeah, I mean, that is essentially what 3D printing should be. Because right now we have
Yeah.
this really rough approximation of it with this additive manufacturing. There are still those light-based methods that are a little bit better. Um, but the other thing about being in space in particular in these current technologies is if there's no gravity, we can't even use those sorts of older
Right.
technologies
Well,
because it requires gravity to like push down one layer onto the next pretty much.
yeah. Although there is a company that is specifically manufacturing 3D printers that work in zero gravity.
Okay, and I'm sure the
Yeah.
carbon what like the light-based one would work as well. But yeah, like you said, what this ultimately leads to is something that builds from the ground up. And that's
Hmm.
sort of what biology is.
Right.
We're essentially 3D printers where our design is encoded in our DNA. and that, our DNA
Right.
is trying to fight against whatever environmental factors like the laws of physics and whatnot.
Yeah,
Um,
you've seen 2001: A Space Odyssey.
a long time ago, yeah.
So when like there's all the monkeys, apes like hanging out on that planet, and then that giant obelisk like lands in the middle of their habitat.
Mm,
That obelisk is people, 2001: A Space Odyssey fans think is a von Neumann probe, meaning that is the virus that spreads life to this like
mm,
conscious, intelligent life to this otherwise very, primitive world.
mm.
And so you could imagine just like sending out these like super high tech 3D printers that maybe they have some of like the software encoding of DNA or whatever else is needed, and you can essentially populate the cosmos with DNA based life.
Mm. And that would be sort of a way to spread the human genome and make us not so dependent on Earth. Like you said, this is a way that we really could escape from Earth. Not really traveling in the sense that we're getting on spaceships as fully grown people and going to these new planets, but we can expand and make sure that the human race still propagates the universe and still lives on, even if we, are on the brink of destruction. So
Mm.
it could be a way of preserving humanity by just sending out a bunch of different probes, making sure it hits, some probably like a planet in the Goldilocks zone somewhere that could probably support our sort of life forms. So
Yeah.
that would be really interesting. Or would it be better to just send simple celled organisms and then they could like evolve to their specific planet that they land on?
Yeah. Well, the trouble with sending actual organisms is that they have to live for the whole time that they're
Mm,
traveling. So
that's
the way
true.
I envisioned it is imagine you just have the code. Like all you need is the information of what DNA is constructed, how DNA is constructed, and then
Hmm.
it's like can be like the size of a needle that basically or like very small that just goes out like near the speed of light, and then it can just assemble like subatomic and atomic structures just having that
Oh,
information
right.
of what to encode, so you wouldn't even need anything living to
Interesting.
create it.
Yeah. So what do you think, just to kind of change subjects a little bit, what do you think are some of the cool technologies being used today? Like there's
Yeah.
some construction, there's a lot of different applications for 3D printing. I'm curious what your thoughts are on, your favorites
Yeah.
so far.
I mean, it seems like there's really cool stuff when you go really small or when you go really big, especially if it's
Mhm.
somewhat complex. So, on the big side, I like this one company that has actually the most expensive 3D printer. It's a $2.5 million 3D printer, and it runs on a track that's 70 meters long. So, this is a big printer.
Wow. What are they
And
printing it? Like what kind of
so you
material?
can print an entire structure. So you can print like I've actually gotten advertised this on Instagram from this company, but you can basically just 3D print a yoga studio in your backyard for not very much money, and they'll come there, they'll set up the track, and then in like a week it'll just 3D print this like fully functional yoga studio. You know exactly what it's going to look like before. It's like all made of the same basic like wood carbon fiber type material. Um,
Interesting. Because I've seen construction where it's almost like a cement 3D printer where it'll just like create this super simple structure and it'll make the walls with this additive layering. But I've
right.
never actually, I don't
It
know if
is
I've seen
additive.
the company you're talking about.
It's not that complex as far as like the shape of it, but it looks
Right.
like a nice modern
Yeah.
yoga studio. So that's very cool to me because it's just like so much easier than trying to actually hire people and the noise and
Hmm.
how long it takes and all
Yeah, and that
that.
could be one thing that helps solve the affordable housing crisis. Like that
Hmm.
could be something that creates a bunch of affordable housing units somewhere so we don't have as big of a homeless problem in certain areas. Like that could
Yeah.
just be something that creates low cost housing. That's really interesting though.
Yeah, and then on the smaller side, I would say anything that's specific, like especially medical applications that are specific to a person, I think is really key. So, for instance, they're creating hearing aids that are based on the mold of your ear that you can 3D print because it's personalized to you. That's
Yeah, it's
one.
way more unique than most people realize.
Right.
Yeah.
And then also prosthetics, like there are a lot of people out there who have really bad ankle issues, and no matter how many surgeries they get, they still have this pain, and it's just not functioning properly. And maybe they have, corrosion in their bones or something. But right now, most people would not get a surgery if it's not needed. But if 3D printing gets good enough, you could imagine it might make more sense to just chop off your foot and just get a prosthetic foot that's like perfectly designed to you to have like the best structural
Hmm.
integrity, and getting like a titanium part of your jaw that's like just perfect to exactly what sort of
Hmm.
support you need. And then the
Yeah.
final application is they're actually now working to 3D print organs. And, we
Hmm.
talked about this a little bit in our medical episode, but they're not able to fully print an organ yet, but they have made some innovations where they can print the scaffolding, a sugar based scaffolding, where the cells can grow on that scaffolding to create the
Hmm.
organ. And they're going through clinical studies now. So that's something that may be available in the near future. And that would be huge for if you don't have to wait for a donor when you need
For
heart
like,
surgery, or you
yeah.
need a lung transplant or a kidney transplant or liver, and you can just get one printed exactly to your specifications with your
Yeah.
blood type and everything. I mean, that is so huge.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite application, like future applications of 3D printing, because I think there's this company, they're called Cell Ink. Essentially, they have this ink that has a bunch of cells in it, but they can create super simple tissue, like the lining of organs and stuff like that, which is really cool.
Hmm.
One of the things I've read about that is difficult if you're not just creating a prosthetic, but something that your body accepts, you need to somehow create a structure um, that has all of the whole vascular network, and that's one of the biggest things because you have little blood capillaries and veins everywhere, and that's one of the hardest problems to solve. But one of the other problems I've heard is the scaffolding that is used can break down and become toxic
Hmm.
the way that it is right now. So the sugar will dissolve and go away, but it still is problematic for long-term use. And I
Hmm.
actually just saw a research paper, I think it was within the last week, where this team, I forgot which university, but they actually made this bioprinting or this 3D printing work without scaffolding, without the same sort of scaffolding. Instead, it used like stem cells, and the stem
Hmm.
cells would after this whole organ was grown, the stem cells would either disappear or sort of integrate with the organ itself or the tissue itself,
Hmm.
which is pretty interesting and one of those things that will make this sort of application more viable in the future. And probably, there's a lot of these things that will need to take place. What would you guess, like 20, 30 years before something like this is viable, or do you think it's shorter or longer than that?
It's hard to say. From my research, it seems like there's a lot of investment and research going into the medical area. So I
Hmm.
think we're going to have some pretty incredible. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years all the major organs can be 3D printed.
Mm.
I mean, maybe not the brain, but
Yeah,
the
that'd be
brain is
hard.
probably going to take like 20, 30, 50 years. But
Yeah.
I'm pretty bullish on how most organs like heart valves, an entire heart, liver,
Yeah.
kidney, lungs, these are maybe lungs might be a little more difficult, but yeah, I'm pretty bullish on that.
Hmm.
Um,
And the other thing about this bioprinting is even if we go away from like organs for humans, if we can print organic tissue, this is one of those things that's necessary for widespread um, lab-grown meat, I believe. I
yeah.
think it's one of those things that we'll need.
Or
Obviously,
for
we
burn
could,
victims.
yeah, yeah, if we're talking actual medical applications, but if we want like just for the whole food, when we talked about this in the future of food,
Right,
they
3D
might be able to
printed
3D print
meat,
fruit.
steaks.
Yeah,
Well, and
exactly.
that's and we mentioned this in that episode, but the beauty of 3D printing a steak is that if it's not 100% perfect, who cares? You just eat it and it's still delicious and nutritious. Whereas
Mhm,
if an organ is not 100%, then your body might reject it. So there's a lot more room for error with 3D printing meat rather than 3D
mhm,
printing organs specific to a human being. And some of the 3D printing meat companies actually started as medical 3D printing companies. So
Oh,
it's,
interesting. And they
yeah,
saw that as like the
they
first.
pivoted. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Interesting.
And then there's, aside from life or death applications, there are just some fun 3D printing applications. Like fashion was one of the earliest and most successful applications because a lot of high end fashion, they only make a select few number of any jewelry item. And
Mhm,
there's also sizing to consider, people's ring sizes and that sort of thing. And they can use silver and other precious metals to create these. So that's big.
mhm.
Handbags and luxury accessories. Although the one challenge I saw there is that counterfeit fashion could become an even bigger problem with 3D printing because already there's like, it's a multi-billion dollar industry
Mhm.
to make fake Louis Vuitton and Chanel bags. And if you can
Yeah.
just download the file and 3D print one yourself for like $10, why would anyone pay, thousands of dollars for the real thing?
Yeah, I'm curious how 3D printed bags would even work. Like leather seems to be one of those materials that would be super difficult to
Yeah, I
print
mean,
with. Maybe like little
you can do like
trinkets.
chainmail or like a lot of like sequency type things and
Yeah,
like
yeah.
yeah, I mean, I don't
Interesting.
know. Personally, I'm not that into that sort of thing, but it's
There's
interesting and
probably a
then
lot of high fashion,
yeah,
with like fashion shows that have these really intricate one-off designs.
right.
I'm sure there's a lot of 3D printed stuff there.
And also in Hollywood with costumes and props,
Oh,
that
yeah.
has been big. So if you think of Iron Man, Iron Man's whole costume was printed using a 3D printer. They printed all of the metal sheets
Hmm.
exactly based on what these 3D designers had specified. And it only costs like, I don't know, $1,000 worth of materials, but you can sell an Iron Man costume for $35,000 if it's like
Wow.
a total replica. Um, so it has some interesting applications for whether you're an entrepreneur who's just trying to like create cool costumes and that kind of thing, or if you're just
Hmm.
a Hollywood producer, you can have these super high tech sci-fi looking things, and you can just have someone design it and then print it without needing to like source different materials and get all these different parts and I mean
Yeah, and if you think one of the things, just to say something quick about that specifically, like the Iron Man, if they wanted to build the molds and everything else with an old school manufacturing method, it would have probably cost hundreds of thousands
yeah,
of dollars. Tooling for manufacturing is stupid expensive. But
right.
if you can, the nice thing about 3D printing is you can create these one-offs without having this high upfront cost. So
Yeah.
that's huge.
I mean, I saw that 3D printing has made an average airplane from Boeing $30 million dollars less expensive because
Wow.
they take a single piece that would be used in an engine that used to require like 20,000 different pieces
Mhm.
all assembled together, and now they can make it with just 200 pieces, all 3D printed. So the order of magnitude of how many fewer parts they need to make, and also just all the costs of sourcing materials made in China, paying the tariffs, you got to
Mhm.
pay for the cost of shipping, and it's like rather than doing all of that, you can just have the design. And I mean, I don't want to get too far into this because this starts to get into my best case scenario, but it's
Yeah.
pretty amazing how this would just completely change trade and the ability for anyone to create whatever they can imagine on demand, only
Yeah.
needing raw materials.
Yeah, I mean it just streamlines the supply chain. So
Hmm.
you don't need to worry about international trade. Anyone in any country can just create what they want whenever they want, pretty much. And that's huge for developing countries or undeveloped and developing countries. And, this stuff like this, if we can really lower the cost of 3D printing, then we can introduce these sort of technologies to lower income countries and they can start to create objects and tools that are useful maybe in a little tribe, for example, that's totally removed in 6 hours from the nearest like trade town. And
Oh
that's
yeah.
fairly common in Africa.
And that sort of gets into education. And 3D
Oh
printing
yeah.
has been super successful with education and vocational
Hmm.
training. And kids in schools nowadays are oftentimes they'll have a 3D printer in their classroom. And whenever they're learning about an object, they can 3D print it and they can hold it in their hands and understand what it is. And they're even being taught how to use these 3D printers, how to build designs, and it's really incredible because it sort of bridges between the digital software world and the real physical world of building real things.
Hmm.
And so that's incredible. And
Yeah,
then there's
and the
just,
other
yeah, go ahead.
Well, so the other thing about education that I love about 3D printers is it shortens the feedback loop. When you're if a
Rapid
student is
prototyping.
Yeah, so if you're able to shorten the feedback loop, they can sort of see, okay, I was wrong in this part of the design. Whatever they're designing, it could be anything, or
Right.
they could be making projects that are sort of useful. And if someone if you go to school or you talk to your parents, you're like, well, what do we need that's like little, a cool little thing? Maybe it's a little phone case, or maybe it's something, one of those things
Yeah.
that you put your phone on and then it amplifies the sound from the speakers. Like, there's a lot of one-off things that you can create that are actually practically useful in your life. And that's one of the other things I think education lacks in a lot of subjects is the real world application of things. Whereas if you get the rapid feedback and something that's practical, you can start to really care about the math, the physics behind the structure of things.
Yeah.
And, it's really good for STEM education, I think, in
Right.
particular.
Yeah. So there's a couple other areas that I want to touch on before we get into the future scenarios. And one of them is environmental, which is totally positive. And then the other one that's a little bit doom and gloom is the military and gun aspect. So
Hmm.
first, let's start with the positive, which is environmental. And they have been having some interesting applications with 3D printing for the environment. So, for instance, in the Maldives, they 3D printed coral reef to help regenerate life in the Maldives. And right now, it's just the structure of the coral reef. It's not like they're actually printing coral, but it is
Yeah.
possible that they could eventually do that as well. And in general, and so then there's also I think it's a Danish company or somewhere in the Nordic area where they have a company that specializes in using recycled plastic as 3D printing material. So this is a way where, right now it's kind of a lot of the recycled plastic doesn't get utilized to its fullest extent because it's kind of hard to like weld it back together and make it into new
Hmm.
stuff. But if you can just have that all be like raw material that feeds into a 3D printer and doesn't have to
Hmm.
always make the same thing, doesn't have to just make water bottles, it can make anything that's plastic, then that's a
Hmm.
much better system for recycling, particularly plastic polymers.
Hmm.
And and then the final thing I'll say on environment is just that there's a huge reduction in carbon emissions because you need far less trade, like far less like bringing materials from here to there, and it just
Yeah.
sort of streamlines the whole process like we've talked about. So
Hmm.
it has some interesting future scenarios for the environment.
Yeah. The one thing I think the positives outweigh the negatives, but it is worth noting that a lot of the materials that are used in 3D printers are still unrecycled plastics, like ABS
Yeah,
plastic, and all. A lot of them can. So if you're 3D printing, particularly, I think it's ABS plastic. There's some plastics that they can emit this small filament, these small filaments of plastic, like during the 3D printing process, and it can be bad if you do it
mm,
in your home. Like it's not very good to breathe that stuff in. But the other thing is, if everybody had a 3D printer and they were just making trinkets, I would imagine that landfills would just
yeah,
overflow with plastics that what didn't necessarily come from recycled plastic in the first place. So
right.
it
Although I don't think that the trinket market is growing. I feel like if
yeah,
anything,
I don't think it will
people
either.
are valuing meaningless plastic items less and less over time.
Right,
Like
I would
even
agree.
our generation compared to our parents, like they cared about like having fine china and like all of these material things, and most millennials just care about having like awesome experiences
Mhm.
more
And
than
then Gen Z is probably even going to be even further than that, like less materialistic than millennials would be my guess.
yeah.
Or it's going to be a cycle. You know, it's hard to tell right now, but
But that is a
uh,
good point. I mean, the most common materials for 3D printer are plastic. So number one is standard PLA.
mhm,
Number two is standard ABS. Then there's
mhm,
resin, and then nylon is not plastic, but um,
mhm.
yeah,
It would be good though to point out that the things that are made with 3D printers aren't these single-use plastics like a water
right.
bottle or something. So
Straw.
they could be things that are actually used time and time again, or it's, you know, a fundamental part of like the tubing of your house, or it's just a repair to some aspect of your
Yeah,
house. So
something that you
it's
want to
probably not,
last a long time.
yeah, it's probably not going to be like we said, we're not just going to have kids making toy after toy with the 3D printer, but we probably will see more practical uses for what is made. And plastics are good for being able to form really intricate shapes. So it's not,
Hmm.
plastics aren't necessarily bad if they don't end up
It's just
polluting the
bad when
environment.
you drink a water bottle in 5 minutes and then it takes millions of years to decompose.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there's probably, I would say that, like I said, there's way more positives, but there is, you know, we should maybe at least consider the fact that
Right, it uses
most things are
plastic.
made from plastics.
So,
Um,
what do you think about the 3D printing gun issue?
yeah, well, when was that story? I think it was like last week or in the last couple weeks that some guy in London got arrested for creating a gun that
Yep.
could fire a deadly bullet.
So, this
Um,
was just in June 19th. So, it was like, a week and a half ago or two
yeah.
weeks ago. And a UK student became the first person ever to be convicted for illegally 3D printing a gun. And when they investigators asked him, well, first of all, I don't. It doesn't. It's not clear how he got caught,
I
but
think I saw that he was like searching how to create a gun. Like
oh, they
his,
found
I
him
think
through
his
his
search
search history.
history,
Oh,
and he also was suspected, I think, for growing pot or something.
oh.
So,
Um, well, anyways, that they asked him. They said, "Hey, why did you 3D print this gun?" And he kind of changed his stories a few times. He was like, "Oh, I'm using it as a prop for this dystopian future film." And they were like, okay, but then why do you need all of the lethal internal components and like bullets and like that kind of
Uh,
stuff? And he like didn't have a good answer, so he ended up pleading guilty. And this kid's like 26 years old. Um, and so it does open up a question. It's more of a question in the U.S. because we have the Second Amendment as part of our Constitution, and that question is: should 3D printing guns be regulated, and if so, how best should it be regulated?
I mean, I would say somehow we need to make sure that guns aren't all over the place like that. I would say
Because
yes,
they're
it somehow needs to
unregistered.
be.
Is the
Yeah,
unregistered factor is why it's illegal even in the U.S.
yeah,
But there are still other loopholes like gun shows that there are quite a number of unregistered guns already in the US.
yeah. I'm not sure how you would regulate that unless you regulated the 3D printers themselves and
Yeah, so
like,
that's one of the options. So either you regulate the 3D printers themselves so that if they recognize a file that's a gun,
uh,
it will just not be able to print it.
mhm.
But you might be able to get around that by making like weirdly shaped guns. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
And then the
I'm not
other
sure.
way is if you regulate the digital STL files themselves. Like you
Okay.
basically have something crawling around the internet, like making sure that any, 3D printed gun STL file immediately gets flagged and then they get a knock on the door from the FBI.
Hmm.
But it seems hard to fully stop through the 3D printing of guns. It seems like there are
Yeah.
enough technologists out there that can use VPN and Tor and other ways of
Hmm.
masking themselves that they could, or like create their own 3D printer that doesn't have those safeguards, or modify their 3D printer so to remove the safeguards. Like it seems quite unlikely that they could fully stop the 3D printing of guns.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's a problem we need to think about pretty seriously, especially as 3D printing gets better and better. But how? I'm not really sure. Because there,
Yeah.
and that's one of the problems with designing policies and regulations is sometimes they're totally ineffective. And
Right.
you know, I would be curious to see if, there's probably a lot of overlap with the parts to 3D printed guns. So does that limit all sorts of products? That I'm not sure. It's a hard problem. I don't really know the answer to it.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are smart people working on it though.
Yeah. Well, we'll have some good time to explore it in the future scenarios, especially around the worst case. So maybe we
Yeah,
take a
let's do
break
it.
now and then get into the worst case scenario.
Sounds good. So what do you think about the worst case scenario?
Worst case scenario.
My worst case scenario is an extrapolation of the 3D printed gun scenario. Meaning, if you imagine that technologists will be able to print whatever the hell they want, which seems pretty feasible if you are able to disguise your internet connection and your IP address and that sort of thing, then you could imagine people 3D printing not only guns in the future, but also viruses or
Hmm.
weapons of mass destruction, potentially,
Yeah.
or or you could 3D print an exact replica of someone's face to bypass facial recognition technology.
Oh, right.
You
Yeah.
could also 3D print someone's fingerprint by like zooming in on a photo of their thumb.
Mm.
You can 3D print a lot of the identifiers that are used to safeguard access to
Mm.
secretive materials or institutions.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
keys are a super, well, yeah, that's probably an outdated example. I take it back.
right,
Because you can
right.
easily make a copy of a key, but
Yeah, but if you think like, okay, well, first, one thing I just want to say that was kind of surprising to me is that theoretically any material can be used in a 3D printer so long as it's solid at room temperature. So there's really no limitation for what can be 3D printed, whether it's cells or metals or
Mm-hmm.
plastics or whatever. So if criminals or terrorists or whomever can 3D print whatever they like, then that would be a big threat to national security and privacy. And so that's really my biggest concern around 3D printing. I will say that it's somewhat less scary than some of the other topics we've had because that seems like something, yeah, it's really bad, but it also seems like something that could be regulated, if not entirely, at least the worst of it could be managed.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas some of the other areas we talked about, like nuclear and AI, like,
Those
those
seem
are
like more real threats. Like they're
right.
more concrete. Yeah.
And 3D printing is still kind of far out. Like, yeah, you can make a dinky little gun, but how much damage is that really going to do to society?
Yeah, you're probably not going to have armor-piercing bullets. It's probably way easier to just get a gun off the black market than it is to 3D print a viable gun.
Right, right. And then the only other negative thing I can think about is there is right now this ongoing question of patents for 3D printed
Mm.
designs. So if you're someone who creates a design, you may not get it patented and then someone may rip it off. But I'm actually not concerned about that. And I kind of take Elon Musk's approach where he has this quote where he says that no one should be credited for anything ever. And I kind of like that because it's like, yeah, the purpose of knowledge is to share knowledge and to learn from each other and to build off
Mhm.
of what others have built. And if you patent everything and sort of sequester everything and no one can really use anyone else's designs, then that seems
Mhm.
like a world that is worse than the world where everyone just shares their patents and we all have enough like, universal healthcare, education, and income where it's not like you need to depend on your patents to earn a living, but there will be much more flourishing for humanity if we do share all of our designs and build off of each other's work.
Mhm.
So I guess my worst case scenario, the worst, is a scenario where criminals and terrorists 3D print guns and viruses and bombs and
Mhm.
bypass facial recognition and that kind of thing. But my
Right.
like sort of less worst, like my kind of bad case is where there's just way too many patents and patent lawsuits and people can't effectively build on the progress of others.
Yeah, I mean, patents originally they were designed with good intentions, I think. It was to kind of help the small guy compete with the big companies and um, even if they didn't have all the funding in the world right away, the patent could help them, help a startup get to a like real marketplace dominance at some point because they're better. The problem is you see like patent trolls that will just own all the patents and then just sue everybody because
Oh
someone
yeah,
like sort of infringes. And
it's all
the
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 big
thing,
guys now.
yeah,
Like if you look
and
at there's just to give you a number, there's the number of patents just in the last few years, 342 patents from General Electric in 3D printing, 191 from HP. I mean, it's all the major companies that are doing this. So if you are a small guy, it's even harder with patents.
yeah,
And you're
yeah, it
not going
has
to
those
sue and
unintended
succeed
consequences.
against GE.
Yeah, no, it's not going to happen because you need like to really have your patent hold up, you need to successfully sue,
Right.
which means you need capital to
You
sue.
basically need more money to win, not
Yeah,
just a better case.
it's it's dumb at this point, especially if we're talking about 3D printing because 3D printing necessarily is cheaper and helps the small guy. It helps
Hmm.
the people, the smaller entrepreneurs create something with from a lower cost or with a lower cost. So it's yeah, I would say patents are outdated, but I don't
Right.
even know what we can do about the patent law
Well,
industry. Like
also
it's so old.
it's bad for competing with China because China has no they
Mm,
patents are not a part of their culture. They steal IP all the time. So
right.
if we are trying to compete with our 3D printing abilities and everyone's fighting over patents and usage while countries like China just take all the best patents and don't care at all, then obviously they're going to make more progress faster. So yeah, it seems that's another concern.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, for my worst case, I mean, you covered some of the dangerous stuff. So the one thing I'll add to the worst case is if some underdeveloped countries or developing countries get a hold of some of these bigger 3D printing technologies, but they just try to crank stuff out without really care for regulation of the structural integrity of certain things. If we're talking about um, airplane parts and those are just being created sort of willy-nilly, it's just the cheapest way to do things and maybe not structurally sound. I could see a scenario where people, smaller countries and smaller companies that aren't as tightly regulated try to compete so much that they do it at the cost of the integrity of certain things. And
Hmm.
obviously, this is the biggest example is through aerospace stuff and also
Right.
through, I mean, automotive kind of, but it's probably not as big of a deal in that scenario.
Although isn't I mean all aerospace is basically Boeing and Airbus, and
Yeah, so
neither of
it's
those are developing countries.
yeah, I guess that
But
that
if
is
they started
hard.
their own airlines, I guess then that would be.
Yeah, and buildings would be another thing. So if you were trying to,
Hmm.
that's one thing that we have seen historically that underdeveloped countries with less regulation around building structural integrity have, buildings just kind of falling apart
Hmm.
because there isn't the regulation around it.
Or like a
Um,
3D printed organ that falls apart inside your body. That would be pretty
yeah,
awful.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that could happen as well,
Hmm.
because the like we said, the scaffolding isn't necessarily stable long term and could become toxic once it disintegrates. And then one more company I just wanted to point out, which we could talk about it for the worst case and the best case, but there's this company called Rocket Crafters that they're 3D printing rockets, like the structure of the rocket, and
Right, I
they're
saw
and
that.
they've been like doing tests. I don't think they're really viable right now, but at some point they probably will be. And
Yeah.
we can create these low cost rockets. So
And
that's
it's like
good
only like
for,
a handful of components. It's amazing. It's like the whole outer shell is just one
yeah,
continuous
yeah.
structure.
It's not a rocket that you would expect from SpaceX that's like a Falcon Heavy or some giant rocket, but it is something that could send up a small refrigerator sized satellite
Hmm.
into orbit. Or, since we're talking about the worst case, it could send a sort of bomb or some sort of weapon to another place for low
Yeah.
cost.
Plus,
Rockets right now are extremely expensive to, if we're
right.
doing like ballistic missiles or something, but if you can create sort of a hacky solution to that, we might
Yeah.
have, terrorist organizations have access to these, smaller rockets, which
Right.
could be really bad.
I mean, if they can just invest in the cutting edge 3D printer and then
Hmm.
they just download the file of how to design a rocket, they don't need that much technical know how to do a
Yeah,
lot of damage.
yeah. So that's obviously not good at all.
Yeah. All right. What do you think for the best case scenario?
Best case scenario.
Best case. So I think for the best case, it's a lot of it is just reducing the supply chain of pretty much all the companies. Like it would be great if we didn't have um, this huge reliance on global trade or these really long, complex supply chains. If we could just create things on demand,
Hmm.
and that's one of those things that I think is true for any industry. For example, like reducing the supply chain in agriculture is super important because then we could have more fresh food everywhere. We don't have to worry as much about, um, vegetables and healthier food getting old. That's not related to 3D printing, but just to kind of illustrate why lowering the supply chain complexity and cost is effective. I mean,
Hmm.
it ultimately boils down to cheaper things for consumers, which is good. And it's
Yeah.
good for people in developing countries in particular because they can actually get products that were completely out of reach previously.
Yeah.
And they can just create something on demand. If they needed this weird tool, instead of having to drive 6 hours to the nearest trade town, you just make it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of what I think for the best case. And then obviously, what if we extrapolate what we were saying about bioprinting, having the whole medical industry transformed by creating organs on demand, specifically for people that have, heart failure, liver failure, anything else. And this could even turn into the whole anti-aging revolution, where people just, when they get too old, they'll just create a brand new young liver, heart,
Yeah.
brain eventually, and you know live for however long. This it's one of those things that that could be dystopian also if people are all living forever,
Right.
but yeah, it could help with
Everyone's
uh,
super jaded and like never smiles or laughs because they've seen it all.
pretty much. Yeah, so I don't know if that itself is part of the best case, but there's a lot of medical advancements that we can do with this bioprinting.
Yeah. Yeah, I like what you said a lot about shortening the supply chain, and I guess sort of the societal view that I think of when I think of the rosiest best case scenario is one where everyone is creating things locally and buying things locally, and the only things we have to trade are raw materials with other countries. And it also kind of reminds me of a quote, which is an optimistic view of how jobs and automation will play out, where rather than it's like, oh, everyone's jobless and people can't eat and it's just terrible, rather than that it's like, okay, the machines are doing all of the fundamental economic activity, and
Hmm.
we are just spending our time entertaining each other. So whether you have a podcast, or you're a musician, or you write novels, or you do interesting scientific research, or maybe
Hmm.
you're a cam girl, or you live stream yourself playing video games, like whatever
Uh-huh.
it is, this whole notion of like us entertaining each other far after the robots have done all of like the real work that is needed
Hmm.
in the economy. I
Right.
think that plays perfectly into the 3D printing best case scenario, because if you maybe rather than doing a podcast or live streaming video games, your thing is you like making little, art pieces, and you can create your own designs, make them locally, sell them to your friends, to people in your community, and this can kind of bring us back to our roots as being like more tight knit communities that can really trade with one another, and while
Hmm.
also not having to worry about like having enough food on the table, or safety, or health, or that kind of thing, or education.
Right. Yeah, I think those are all wonderful. That is
Yeah.
very rosy. I like it.
Yeah, and then obviously when we go super far future, it's like von Neumann probes and just
Yeah.
colonizing the cosmos. And I mean, I don't know how feasible this is given the other possibilities, but maybe rather than 3D printing an organ once it fails, it's like you go into a scanner, once a week or once a month, and it just like, sort of repairs and 3D prints like, different cells that have died like throughout your body. So you're kind of like always top notch, or something
Yeah,
like
that
that.
gets really into the whole
Nano printing.
yeah, nano printing.
And
Yeah.
And then I guess another like just I like to think of just what is like if I could really have it my way, if I were king of the universe, what would I do with this technology? And if you can imagine just sort of like you're walking down the street and you just think, you know what? I would love to have a jetpack right now. And you just think, I want a jetpack. And then your little like your money in your bank account, in your digital bank account from your augmented vision glasses, just goes like, and you just subtracts like whatever the cost of a jetpack is. And then these little like probes like construct a jetpack in real time right in front of you, and you're like, oh sweet, here's my jetpack. And then you like go and you go off to work, and but basically just creating anything like seemingly from nothing, but really you're building it on a subatomic level or atomic level. Like that would be phenomenal. I would love that.
Yeah.
I could
And it would
actually
be
live my dream of building a water slide from my bedroom, childhood bedroom all the way down to the pool.
that's awesome. Yeah, that would be crazy, and it would be probably integrated with some sort of AI where you can just have a rough idea of what you want, and then the AI
Oh
will come
yeah,
up with,
the AI
even if
knows what
it's
I
something
want.
that's, yeah, it'll never, even if it's never been created before, it can be like, okay, I sort of know what you want. Given what I know you want, I'm gonna make it, to the best of my ability, and then, that's, I
Yeah,
don't know, that could be really cool.
yeah. It's
Um,
it's like in if you ever played Halo Forge, which is this sub game within Halo where you can basically
mhm,
just create your own world and like anything can just instantly pop into existence. Like that, I think that would be like the furthest extent of what 3D printing could be capable
mhm.
of.
Cool. So, maybe to round it out, what do you think for the likely scenario?
Most likely scenario.
Yeah, so my likely scenario is one in which there is rapid progress in medical, in manufacturing, in fashion, in aerospace, aviation, all of the industries, the big industries where there's big investment dollars being invested. I
Hmm.
think there's going to be a lot of progress.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to solve a lot of our problems with trade, and it's going to lower costs for consumers and lower costs for businesses, make things more efficient. It's also going to make it more clear which raw materials we really need,
Hmm.
and that'll become a bigger conversation, and countries will sort of be known for what raw materials they have. I
Hmm.
don't think it's going to be that big for consumers in the short term because
Right.
if you can just buy whatever you need, why not buy it from a 3D printing company that just specializes in that rather than like have your own 3D printer?
Right.
Right now, it doesn't seem like you would. I mean, how often does some little part in your home break down and you need it fixed? Like, it's just not, doesn't happen often enough for you to invest in a 3D printer. But I will say 3D printers are really cheap now. It's only $200 to get a pretty decent 3D printer. So,
Yeah.
I think it's going to slowly move up the curve for consumers, but I don't
Hmm.
foresee that really taking off in the same way that I foresee it taking off for industries.
Yeah. Yeah, I see the consumer aspect of this a little bit more like the Amazon model, where there's like a centralized warehouse in the big cities that has the big infrastructure and they have all the materials that you could possibly want. So if you order something, they just 3D print it there, and then maybe a drone flies it to you or
Yeah.
something along those lines, where
Like
it's still sort of on demand. You just don't have it in your house.
like there's
It
an
can be created.
like there's
Go
an
ahead.
Amazon the Amazon blimp or the mothership they call it that's just floating above LA, and when I say that I want something like an iPhone charger, it'll just 3D
Hmm.
print it in that mothership and then a drone will come deliver it to me. And it's like,
Yeah.
why do I need the 3D printer and all the materials? Like I can just outsource that to Amazon or whomever.
Yeah, it's not like it's really that necessary for you to have one in your home. It might even be a little bit annoying to have that in your home and have to deal with it rather than, like, it's still easier to go on and shop for something, and then it can be created with a top of the line 3D printer rather than some junky old like
Hmm.
$200 printer that has sort of a crappy finish to it.
Right. Although I will say that once I have kids, if and when I have kids, I would
Mm.
want a 3D printer in the house purely just for educational and
Yeah.
fun purposes.
Yeah, that is one thing to note. Like, education is really something that can be transformed by 3D printing, especially the whole engineering discipline.
Hmm.
Um, So that's really big. I know a lot of schools have them. Most schools have a 3D printer somewhere. Maybe
Yeah.
not the highest quality in all the schools, but it's getting to the point where schools tend to be focusing a little bit more on STEM education,
Hmm.
at least, in a lot of places. So it's it's something we will see more and more of, I think. In the likely scenario, really ultimately, I don't think the likely scenario is much different from the best case scenario. This is one of those topics where it doesn't really seem like there are that many downsides to
Yeah.
advancing more and more because it's not like the weaponry is going to be that big of an issue besides maybe the rockets. If somebody
Hmm.
can get a hold of rockets, and they might, but they're still not going to necessarily be the highest quality rockets in the short term. It might be easier to get rockets from a traditional, I don't know who supplies rockets to terrorists, or for
Hmm.
example, but yeah, for the most part, I think this is going to be a likely scenario that matches up pretty closely with the best case.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess one final thing to say before we end is if anyone listening to this is thinking of starting a 3D printing business, it's a pretty good time to start, and you can get into it fairly with a fairly low upfront investment. I mean, we talked about you can buy a pretty decent 3D printer for 200 bucks. For a few thousand bucks, you can get one that actually creates useful materials that can be sold. And we talked about you can create a replica of the Iron Man costume for 1,000 bucks and sell it for 35,000 bucks. I'm sure there are many other examples of,
Mm,
especially when there's a lot of fanfare around a particular thing like Iron Man.
right.
So, and like, fashion and jewelry and cost, like, I think that is sort of what is most people are most willing to pay up for right now.
Hmm.
I mean, other than like, life or death medical sort of things.
Right.
So I would definitely recommend exploring this area if you're at all interested in becoming a 3D printing entrepreneur.
Yeah, for sure. And even if you're just building things and you want a prototype, 3D printing is a great way to kind of get an idea of what something will be in the real world. And I know a lot of
Hmm.
big companies do that. They'll just prototype with a 3D printer to kind of finalize a design and then sort of narrow in on something else. So it's a really cheap way to prototype, even if your company itself is not
We
3D
are all
printing.
gathered here today to
Yeah.
talk about
So,
three very important
Awesome.
things.
Well, thank you everyone for
We're going
listening.
to talk
This has
about
been the
what
future
has
of
happened,
3D printing,
what is
and
currently
we hope to see you
happening,
next time.
and what will inevitably happen.
The past, the present, and the future.
Our computer is picking up a strange signal.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
What's the world coming to?
The past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and the future, baby. The past, the present, and the future.
Will attempt to stimulate consciousness.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
Behind the strange signal is an alien
The
intelligence.
past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and the future, baby.
It's possible.
Hey Futurists, if you've made it this far, you might be wondering who created the Hence the Future theme song. It was created by the Walden Brothers, and you can find them on Spotify. The Walden Brothers also produced the sound bites for the worst case, the best case, and the most likely future scenarios. At Hence the Future, we're always looking for ways to improve the quality of our episodes and our predictions. To that end, we're building a team of researchers to curate the most authoritative and highly vetted sources as the foundation for every episode. If you'd like to support these efforts, you can donate a small monthly amount at anchor.fm/hencethefuture. And if you haven't done so already, please rate and review the podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. We appreciate your support.